Hello and welcome. This is Congruent with Cass the Coo and me, Seal the Human. Let's talk about chocolate. And with every turn we take within our consumer market is something awful or tragic, someone being exploited, someone at the end of the stick as sociopathic capitalist ghouls strip away as much humanity from people around the world as they can, because money or something. I love chocolate. It's a versatile ingredient that can be used in many sweet and savory ways. It's rich and unique. For me, it's been one of my favorite things to eat. And while I knew where it came from, I didn't quite grasp the conditions in which it came from. It has a long journey from seed to the chocolate bars we have on shelves across the entire globe. Good quality chocolate is expensive, which I always thought made sense because of this journey. I've known the basics of how it's cultivated, but the majority of my knowledge comes from how chocolatiers handle the already processed cacao beans. Chocolate is a heavily processed bean from cacao trees, which grow in the ranges from approximately 10 degrees north to 10 degrees south of the equator. The growing conditions are pretty specific. Cacao doesn't thrive without a pretty stable and warm temperature throughout the year and a fair amount of rainfall. None of the pods ripen at the same time, so they must be hand-picked by somebody who has experience and can discern ripeness. From there, the pods are split and the inside of the beans and pulp are separated out. They are then fermented for 6 days and then dried and shipped off. All of this process is costly in terms of human labor, checking the ripeness, hand-picking the pods, splitting them open and separating them again by hand of any that have fungus, and then the fermentation process. During this process, it needs to be watched and turned multiple times to ensure a good and even fermentation. The drying process is particular too. The beans are turned regularly to ensure that everything is fully dried in climates that aren't always ideal for this. Finally, they are aged anywhere from 1 to 3 months. At this point, they are ready to be sold to companies that produce chocolate products from the raw cacao. It's a labor-intensive crop that requires some care to produce quality. And surely it's worth the effort, right? Well, most of the world's cacao supplies comes from Ghana and Ivory Coast. Now, Ivory Coast alone produces about 40% of the supply, yet many of the cacao farmers have been living well below the extreme poverty line of $1.25 a day. Most of them live with enough money to cover about 50 to 80 cents for each dependent of their family, at most adding up to $5 a day for expenses. The entire process and all the labor and experience for $5 a day on a good day. The CEO of Barry Callebaut last year made $5 million just to show the top end of the supply chain. The beans are sold from the farmers to middlemen who then sell to the companies, usually mixing many harvests of beans together. Some of the money to be made is taken by the middlemen. But the compensation for cacao beans is just not covering the expenses of the farmers or the communities that produce this crop. A metric ton of cacao beans costs about $2,400 US. A ton. That's hand-picked and with the pulp fermented away and the beans dried of almost all the moisture. They are much, much lighter in weight than when they were first picked. A ton of them in this condition. Aside from keeping people in a situation of just surviving, the extreme poverty of cacao production also leads to something absolutely horrific: child labor and child slavery. To help meet basic needs for their families, farmers have been using their children to help out in farming cacao in some effort to lower production costs. They take them out of school to try to keep basic needs met for their families. Most of the farmers live in huts without running water, without power, without proper nutrition, living on the bare minimum. They work long hours with dangerous tools and pesticides without proper protection. Many farming communities lack access to education, and when it is available, they can't afford to let their children attend. In Ivory Coast and Ghana alone, there are over 1.5 million child laborers. Most of the children are simply working on their parents' farms, but that becomes an issue when the work is hazardous. That's working with dangerous tools, working long hours, carrying heavy loads, being exposed to chemicals like pesticides, all of which is happening. And while they are being harmed physically, they're also not receiving an education, as they are busy laboring. Not all children working on cacao farms are in family business, though. Children are also trafficked from surrounding regions into Ivory Coast as extremely cheap sources of labor to work on the plantations. Children who are trafficked and live in slavery can be bought for as cheap as $40. People, children, human life, for plantation work to supply our worldly cacao needs, $40 is all it's worth. In the efforts to crack down on child trafficking, the Ivory Coast government is trying to be more active and strict in dealing with traffickers. At the beginning of July, 10 men were sentenced to a decade in prison for their trafficking of 40 minors. And while this is a step in a direction of addressing trafficking and working for a change, this was one single trip of ferrying minors to work in plantations from a single group of men. The thought of hundreds of thousands of minors being trafficked and put to work to supply cacao beans at cheaper cost is actually sickening. But there are certainly ways to mitigate this. It's been a problem for decades, and there's actually been an increase in the percentage of labor that is composed of children since cacao bean tracking has been implemented by companies. The efforts that leading chocolate companies have made have amounted to absolutely no decrease in child labor. Still, the reasons for children being used in the first place is a basic one. Farmers are looking for ways to make production cheaper because of their extremely low wages. Of course, increasing the compensation is probably a lot to ask for companies participating in a $140 billion market. Yeah. In 2019, Mars made $18 billion alone. The family behind it is worth almost $90 billion. Yet, the farmers that supply a major ingredient for their flagship products are struggling to meet basic needs as they live in some of the most impoverished communities around the world. Just like with most third world countries, they aren't without an abundance of natural resources and populations to maintain thriving communities, but they are completely and utterly exploited. The farmers deserve better in life. Cacao is a wonderful ingredient that brings joy around the world, and most farmers that produce the cacao that the rest of the world enjoys can't even afford to taste it themselves. They'll toil for years and years, being heavily exploited along the way for an incredible product that they will themselves never get to enjoy. It's a disgusting display of humanity from companies seeking profits at any expense, without any value being applied to human life. The middlemen sell to large companies around the globe, but these companies have local grinders and processing plants for the beans to pass through. The governments of these countries have decreased export taxes on cacao in an effort to ease costs, but since those taxes are paid by the large companies, those savings don't actually help the farmers who need it. Companies like Barry Callebaut, Olam International, Cargill, and Simois are the ones who benefit, companies that are making billions and fail to pay the farmers anything even close to reasonable. They absolutely do not need a better situation in all of this. They need to take responsibility for their supply chains They need to provide fair payments to those that produce their goods. They need to actually treat humans like life that matters. Their responses have been to trace beans to farms in an effort to help deforestation and to stop child labor. They've continually set deadlines and marks to meet, ones that continually pass by as failures, only to be reset for the future. The biggest thing has been the push for fair trade certification, which doesn't allow for children to be used, and this, of course, has its own issues. Fair trade agreements allow for better profits, reaching cooperatives of farmers. It has allowed for infrastructure to be built and for life to start improving. Funds paid into the Fair Trade Community Development Fund has allowed farmers to get much-needed community resources like wells with clean water, schools, health clinics. Yet, there are many cases of fair trade farmers existing well below a living income. The prices set by fair trade agreements are far from appropriate compensation, and the farmers are still not receiving what they deserve. Some farmers even still use child labor, but when they are audited for the fair trade assessments, they'll make sure anyone underage cannot be seen or found in farming operations. With deforestation also a huge issue in areas of cacao production, fair trade isn't doing as much. However, with the global climate change moving into the eyes of corporations as the new thing to care about, the chocolate companies have begun to worry about deforestation over child labor. Because it's the popular thing to care about, because it hasn't been an issue for decades, I guess, and there are solutions to both problems. What do they care, though? They're just trying to turn profits like any good business would do, right? And with all of this, are there any consequences for major chocolate companies? Juneteenth was recognized as a federal holiday on June 17th, 2021, when Joe Biden signed it into law. It's a day to remember when enslaved people were freed in Texas, the last state in the Confederacy to have them. The outward appearance by the Democrats is that, hey, we recognize the slavery in our country's history, and we want to do the bare minimum for atoning for these crimes against humanity. So here's a federal holiday, of which many of those who are negatively affected by institutionalized racism will likely not be able to take the day off from work. Great job, Biden. So how does this relate to cacao farming? Okay. The very same day, June 17th, 2021, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor, 8-1, in favor of Nestle's North America subsidiary and Cargill in a child slavery suit brought on behalf of 6 former child slaves from Mali. These companies were accused of aiding and abetting human rights violations by buying cocoa from Ivory Coast despite knowing about the child slavery being used to help produce the cacao beans. This decision reinforced that the Alien Tort Statute, which permits foreign citizens to sue in U.S. courts for human rights abuses, does not really apply to U.S. businesses. While the U.S. government says it's right of us to recognize our country's history with slavery, we're totally okay with U.S.-based businesses still encouraging and benefiting from slavery in other countries, just not our own, kinda. But it's okay because it's somewhere else in Africa, which is somehow better. Now, I still love chocolate, and there's no reason we can't enjoy chocolate while the farmers who produce cacao receive their fair share of revenue. The chocolate industry as a whole has been filled with pure sociopathy in its pursuit of profits over human lives, but that doesn't mean that things can't change for the better. Consumer-based changes can be made by buying fair trade chocolates, but the underlying issue is the capitalist market that allows companies to fully exploit human lives for money. Fair trade chocolate at least helps to better farming communities and build needed infrastructure, even if it's just a small step in the right direction. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Congruent. Stay cute, friends. Bye-bye.